First, I want to thank everybody for coming to my talk. I know you have options, so I appreciate that you're here. Also, I really want to thank Etienne and 7 CTOs. For various of you who are in this room, you've all have been a meaningful and important part of my career and my personal life. And if you're here, I want to say thank you, and thank you to Etienne for organizing them. And to everybody else who I might not know personally, I want to thank you all for being members, for coming here, for being present, sharing, and interacting with each other. I've learned so much from all of you, just chatting casually. So, smart group of people. Let's see. So, my name is Frank. I am the CTO and co-founder of a company called Howdy.com. We're a platform for hiring nearshore talent. Companies, engineering teams, engineering departments in the US use our platform to recruit, to employ, to provide local benefits, equipment, and offices to their nearshore teammates. You can think of it a little bit as build your own remote, hybrid, if you want, nearshore team as a service. We do that for a monthly fee. So, to tell the truth, I was not thrilled to try to write the contents for this talk. And the reason is because the AI hype, or the generative AI, what do we call it, revolution or whatever, has been around for a little while, maybe a few months, a year, something like that. And the same things I've noticed have been said over and over and over again, which is understandable because it hasn't been around for that long, so the same tropes get repeated. And I didn't want to do that to you all, and I didn't want to do that to myself, so I really struggled with that. I didn't want to repeat some of the same concepts. But number two is I don't think I can predict the future here. And this is what my talk is going to be a little bit about. It's going to be about some of the major developments in software engineering and in computer science and the unintended consequences, the things that happened, and why I think it's really, really hard to predict what's going to happen with generative AI and software engineering. So better, I think, than trying to predict what's going to happen, I think it's a little bit better to take a step back and adopt a observe, orient, decide, act loop. And I'll go into what that means. So better than try to predict, I think it's better to take a posture where we're observing and acting. Let me tell you what I mean. All right, so why should we have that talent strategy in the age of AI? It's because I want to avoid, I think we all want to avoid being embarrassed, going very enthusiastically into some new trend or some new technology, only to have to reverse it or completely adapt it a little bit later, right? We want to make some informed decisions here. So let's take a little trip down memory lane. Here are some of the major advancements in software engineering. So we'll start with, I don't know, the first little fish to come out of the ocean, out of the assembler and binary and into imperative programming and object-oriented programming languages. That was fun. Do you all remember? Okay, question. Do you guys know one of the big promises back in the 70s and 80s of what object-oriented programming was going to bring? If you could say it in one word. There you go, reusability, that's right. So for those of you who might not know, the idea was you could pick a concept in your domain, let's say a car. You write the class for a car, so you write the code for a car, and it's all encapsulated, nice and pretty. And guess what? You reuse that car object over and over and over, and you never have to think about cars again because you wrote a beautiful class. Raise your hand if that's worked for you. Not even an account, like an account class? No, or user class? No, you don't have a user class in a folder that you break out whenever you build a new web app? No? No. Neither do I. So here's the next one. Design patterns. This one was fun in the 2000s, 1990s, and so on. Here's an example of model view controller and so on. Design patterns were a lot of fun, right? Do you all remember the craziness with design patterns? We're going to go into that. NoSQL databases. I remember this one. ACID transactions. Man, they're a pain in the ass, and 99% of people don't even use them. You know, it's dating apps and so on. You don't need them. Let's ditch schemas. Let's ditch ACID transactions. Let's just get rid of all that, and things will be better. I remember that one. Big data and Hadoop, I remember this one. Remember everybody? That one was the big one. MapReduce and everything like that. Now we use streams. There's probably still some good use cases for this, but I remember that hype. Microservices is my favorite one because this is when I transitioned, during this I transitioned out of software engineering and into product management, and the reason this one is interesting is because I got to see it from the outside. That was fun. So we went through all of those major advancements in computer science and engineering, and it's heaven, right? I think I'll stop my talk here because it was solved. We solved it. Here's why it's important to kind of think about how we approach these new technologies. How many of you are familiar with this? It's the Everett Rogers diffusion of innovations model. This is particularly important for us because what this model says is that about 2.5% of the population, I think it's even greater here in this room, are they're risk tolerant of new technology. They're not failure sensitive, so they will adopt things. They have wide social networks where they pick up new ideas and they try them and employ them. How many of you have spent some of your time undoing some of the work of these early adopters and early innovators? Yeah, please raise your hand if you've done it. Here, I like this one. Raise your hand if you've undone your own work. There you go. That's me too, yes. So this is what we're going to talk about, why it's important to remind ourselves of some of the special techniques that exist to mitigate this risk. Okay, I'm going to do something interesting. I've never done this before. It's a little unorthodox. Actually, this is better. Okay, so you are all now in the Church of Software Engineering. I hope I see you on Sunday again. I'm going to be the Pope of this church, and you all will be my congregation. So yeah, we're going to do a reading. Where's my clicker? We're doing a reading from the book of Benji Smith, Object-Oriented Programming Revelations. I'm not trying to give any messages with the numbers. I just chose them randomly, so don't read into that. Okay, here we go. I'm going to do a skit for y'all. I'm planning a Java-based web application and evaluating various J2EE frameworks. After hours of reading through documentation, I'm ready to gouge my eyes out. Let's pretend I've decided to build a spice rack. I've done woodworking before, and I know I need wood, a tape measure, a saw, a level, and a hammer. So I go to the hardware store to buy the tools, and I ask the sales clerk, where can I find a hammer? A hammer, he says, nobody really buys a hammer anymore. They're kind of old-fashioned. Really? I asked why. Well, the problem with hammers is that there are so many different kinds. Sledgehammers, claw hammers, ball-peen hammers. What if you bought one kind of hammer and then realized you needed a different kind of hammer? You'd have to buy a whole separate hammer. As it turns out, most people really want just a single hammer that can handle all the different kinds of hammering tasks. Well, I suppose that sounds all right. Can you show me where to find a universal hammer? No, we don't sell those anymore. They're pretty obsolete, really. I thought you just said that a universal hammer is the future. Well, as it turns out, if you make only one kind of hammer capable of performing all kinds of hammer tasks, then it isn't very good at any of them. Oh, there we go. I just read that one. Sorry about that. I'm going to keep reading it. Driving a nail with a sledgehammer isn't very effective, and if you want to kill a home intruder, then there's really no substitute for a ball-peen hammer. I guess that's true. So if nobody buys universal hammers anymore, what kinds of hammers do you sell? Actually, we don't sell hammers at all. So what people really needed wasn't a universal hammer. It's always better to have the right kind of hammer for the job. So we started selling hammer factories, capable of producing exactly the kinds of hammers that you need. But I don't really want to buy a hammer factory. That's good because we don't sell them anymore. We discovered that most people don't actually need an entire hammer factory. Some people, for example, will never need a ball-peen hammer, so there's no point in buying a hammer factory that can produce every kind of hammer. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So instead, we started selling schematic diagrams for hammer factories, enabling our clients to build their own hammer factories, custom engineered to manufacture only the kinds of hammers that they need. Let me guess, you don't sell those anymore? Nope. We sure don't. As it turns out, people don't want to buy an entire factory just to manufacture a couple of hammers. Yeah, I would agree with you there. Yep. So we started selling hammer factories. Each hammer factory is built for you by experts in the hammer factory business, so you don't have to worry about the details. Well, that doesn't really... I know what you're going to say. And we don't sell those anymore either. For some reason, not many people were buying Hammer factories. When we stepped back and looked at the whole entire global tool infrastructure, we determined that people were frustrated with having to manage and operate a Hammer factory as well as the Hammer factory that it produced. When we analyzed the situation, we determined that it was just too complex for someone who just wants to build a spice rack. Yeah, no kidding. So this week, we're introducing a general purpose tool building factory so that all your different tool factories can be produced by a single unified factory. The factory will produce only the tool factories that you actually need, and each one of those factories will produce a single factory based on your custom tool specifications. You'll have exactly the hammer that you need, though you might have to deploy some configuration files. So you don't have any hammers? No. If you really want a high-quality, industrially engineered spice rack, you need something more advanced than a simple hammer from a hardware store. And this is the way everyone's doing it now? Yes. Well, all right, I guess if that's what I'll have to do, if this is the way things are done now, I guess I better learn how to do it. Good for you. This thing comes with documentation, right? Who here is guilty of over-applying some of those design factories, some of those design patterns? I certainly am. I think the one that I overdid a little bit was like a singleton pattern here. So there you go. Out of curiosity, I was wondering if you could still find factories out in the wild. So before, I went to the GitHub code search feature, and it turns out, yeah, they're still out there. Let me see if I can, it's kind of hard for me to see them, but I'm going to switch here. Kind of hard to see here, but here are some examples. Vespa Engine, MongoDB, Ant Media, Apache Struts. Apache Struts doesn't surprise me. Yeah. Okay, story number 2. Maybe some of you remember this one. This one is from the team at guardian.co.uk. If you don't know who The Guardian is, they're one of the most popular websites, news websites in the UK, and actually just everywhere now. And this is back from 2011. For a little context, this is their team, J2EE, ORM, Oracle, so that's their era. All right, we know this problem, right? It's 2010, 2011, iPhone just came out, Web 2.0, all these things, podcasts, new media, microblogging, blogging, lots of traffic, lots of new content, things are changing. Here's some of the normal scaling problems that these teams have, right? In particular, for them, they had so much data, so many updates, and so on, that migrations took a long time. Very dangerous for a news organization, because if a journalist needs to post something breaking, and they can't do it because the migration is running, then that's not going to work. Here's some more of their motivation for the challenges that they were having with their ORM and their Hibernate. Do you all remember this whole mess? Please, my apologies if you're using it now, but that's horrible. You remember tens of thousands of Hibernate XML configs, the domain objects, all that crazy, all that incidental complexity for dealing with ORMs in J2EE 10, 15 years ago. So, the wave of the future, here comes that new hotness, here comes the paradigm shift. We don't need any of that stuff. We don't need schemas. We don't need atomic transactions and all whatever it is. Here's some more of the reasons and reasoning. My favorite is the one at the bottom. So this is quoted from their presentation. Produces a net reduction in lines of code and complexity. Raise your hand if you believe that one, right? That's it. Here's a little bit of history for posterity's sake. These are slides from the actual presentation that they released publicly, saying, hey, we're switching to NoSQL. This is why it works for us. Big deal, big example, right? Well, they migrated, and things were good. They solved all their problems. It wasn't an issue anymore. Here's what's really funny is that this is on their own website. I love that. I had to dig for it. So this was in 2018. Of course, what did we find out? What didn't they anticipate? How complex queries can be if you don't have a set schema. Data integrity and consistency issues, right? Because MongoDB's got eventual consistency and so on. the operational overhead of managing a distributed, horizontally scalable database. Somebody has to do it. You're switching one kind of overhead for another. It's not a silver bullet. So that's sort of story number 2 about our adoption, over-eager adoption of technology and how we need to be a little bit careful about it. Here's something super interesting that I noticed. If you read their blog post about their reversal and going back and using a Postgres SQL in certain places, so they weren't all MongoDB. Take a look at the timeline. The Mongo migration happened in 2011, and one of the reasons that they cited for moving off of Postgres was the lack of JSON. Somebody's nodding their head over there. That's my guy right there. For the lack of JSON columns, and those were eventually released in 2013. But notice when they migrated back, when they undid their decision. They didn't undo it until 2018. Now, all respect to the team, I'm sure this isn't telling the whole story, and there's all kinds of complicated reasons why they couldn't do it. I absolutely know that. But it's still kind of interesting, and I wonder how much of the sunk cost fallacy was at play here, right? Because it took them 5 more years to kind of bite the bullet and make that transition back. It also brings up an interesting thing about how humans learn. We're actually not that great at learning from our own mistakes compared to learning from others' mistakes, right? So if you can imagine, we're in the village thousands of years ago, and the one guy goes over to that part of the forest, and the village is telling him, hey, don't go over there. The leopard's going to eat your face. And he goes, his face is eaten, and everybody learns from that. It's easier to learn from the guy who stepped in the pits compared to the failures that we have, because there's ego involved, because maybe there's something to blame involved. It's easier to kind of cop out and blame something else. So I think this is a really interesting example here. All respect to the team, I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but it's illustrative. Segment, curious how many of you all use Segment? Yeah, it's an analytics platform, super sophisticated, super successful, was eventually acquired by, what company was it? Twilio, that's right. Great company, great tool. They have a similar story here. So here is their big announcement. This is back from 2015, why microservices work for us. I think we all know the story, right? The pitch and the drive for microservices, the initial monolith. It has a lot of overhead when you're coordinating with multiple teams, a lot of data. There's scaling challenges because you can't scale parts of it independently. It's harder to coordinate if everybody's working in that same code base or concerns and so on. And they wanted some of that individual scalability, that individual or independent observability, and so on. So those are the reasons that they quoted. Again, it was heaven after they did it. They solved all their problems, and they absolutely loved it until just a little while ago. So to microservices and back again. Why Segment went back to a monolith. Now, to be fair here, they didn't actually go back completely to the monolith, just a certain part of their architecture. They call it centrifuge, I believe. So just the part that ingests their data from customers, that is a monolith, and that dispatches the incoming data to the right place after some processing and so on. What they quoted as some of those challenges with microservices were, well, now we know it, right? In retrospect, the operational overhead. Each new service introduces tons of operational overhead, and it ranged from setting up monitoring and alerting to handling deployment and scaling. We know this story. Data consistency, when multiple services are managing their own different data, ensuring consistency is a pain in the ass. Network complexity, developer overhead, it goes on, right? These are things, maybe they could have been anticipated, who knows, but kind of bit them and they were back. Here's a really interesting thing that I learned reading through this. If you read through why they moved back and the decisions they made in technology, it's actually really interesting. What's old is new again, right? So microservices everywhere, like we talked about, they went back to the monolith in a specific place. So all credit to them. Job queues everywhere. Everything's a job queue. Let's set up the job queue services. Everything's a job. Everything's a worker. You know what they replaced that with? A table in Postgres or whatever it was. Imagine that. jobs in a table. I was surprised by that. JSON and REST APIs everywhere. They replaced that with, in their monolith for this ingestion portion, with RPCs. I can't remember the last time I wrote a remote procedure call. Maybe that says more about me, but right, this is kind of old. It's been a while since I've done one of those. I'd have to look up the APIs. I don't know how to do that. Very interesting. So essentially what we're trying to do is kind of prevent tech deja vu, where something new comes along, we take it, where we're companies and people who are innovators and early adopters, and we take on something maybe without realizing that we're applying it over eagerly, only to have to reverse some of those investments. And that's what we want to avoid. So we know some of those risks, right? I went over some of these risks with microservices and design patterns. Some of the risks that, again, have been kind of discussed about over and over and over again, so I'm not going to do it to you, but I'll mention them very quickly, and those are things like copyright infringement for auto code generating AI tools, legal precedents and uncertainty, open source violations, IP violations, security implications, and so on for new tools and new paradigms with AI. I wanted to bring up something about the distinction between adopting a whole new tech, let's say something like a database, versus innovations in personal workflows. So for example, what do I mean by that? New tech, I think, is a little easier to corral, right? So if it's a new database, a new architecture, that's sort of team-oriented. The team has to review it. There are team architecture reviews and code reviews. And if there's a big investment that you're going to make in MongoDB, for example, or whatever new database comes out, there's a hypothesis. It's going to reduce the page load time or my API throughput or whatever. That's easy to measure because that's what you do that. You measure pre and post. You determine whether or not that was successful. And we have a bunch of team-oriented dynamics, things like team postmortems, to determine whether we liked that investment, whether it was working for us, it was worth the effort, and so on. Individual techniques, though, are a little bit harder. So, for example, these are, are your developers using Notepad for their workflow? Oops, can you all see that? No, okay. It's just a message from my wife. It shows up here, but not up there. Thanks. Okay. So those are individual workflows. Are they using Trello to manage their things or a spreadsheet to manage their things? So this is much harder, especially with early innovators and early adopters, especially in the era of AI-generated code. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, I'm just going to tell my devs not to do that. Like, don't use ChatGPT-4 to generate SQL statements and unit tests and so on. You can do that. But we're not watching 24/7. They're in their private homes. You're not going to be watching over their shoulder the whole time. But that's not actually what I'm worried about. What I'm more concerned about are the new paradigms and new tools that come out that aren't explicitly ChatGPT-4 and new things that we can't even predict now. So there's going to be things that are going to have the same sort of risks, but be presented completely differently that we might not catch. So how do we handle this case? This is actually kind of interesting. I'm going to borrow some metaphors here from the military because I'll go into why. So this is kind of a stretched metaphor here, but who's familiar with the term fog of war? The idea, okay, lots of military buffs here. For those of you who aren't, it's just the idea that oftentimes we have to make decisions with incomplete or inconsistent information. We don't know everything that's going on. We're getting all kinds of mixed signals, and still we need to make the right decision. And the military, obviously, military strategists have a lot to say about this topic. Here's why this is important. We're all in the AI fog of war. And other companies are coming to pitch you their AI techniques. They've all figured out the paradigms. They've developed these new techniques in their teams, in their organizations, and so on. They're going to codify them into their products. They're going to become the new trends. They're going to be the things that you hear about, that you read about, and so on. So what do we do about this? Here's the challenge, right? As these individuals, other companies, other vendors, and our own teams, these individuals are going to be exploring these new techniques on their own. They're going to individually capture lessons. They're going to learn things. The challenge is that we somehow want to codify that into our tech strategy as the leaders of the organization. What's our framework? How do we do this? What are our policies? How do we do the training and so on? And how can our team leads and EMs and directors all be part of that conversation, given that these innovations are happening at an individual level, especially for bigger organizations? So integrate lessons learned from individual experimentation and innovation. I'm going to borrow another military tactic here, or technique, that I think is useful for us to think about this age of the AI fog of war. What's really interesting about the military is that they have a similar problem, especially if you all know anything about special forces. We are in San Diego, after all, home of the Navy SEALs. The interesting thing here is that individual units are overcoming and innovating all the time. And the military is huge. So how do those individual lessons learned percolate up to a military strategy, military doctrine, training, and so on? So the military actually has a really good way to do this. And they really care about it because for them, innovation out in the field is a matter of life and death. How do you get into a building? How do you track somebody? How do you set up your equipment? Is this rifle or is this airplane working, down to the individual level so that we can complete a mission or complete an operation? Here's how it works in the military. This is stuff that we all do naturally, but it's much better to point it out and do it intentionally. So the idea here is that data collection and reception happens at the individual unit and individual level. This process revolves around the idea or a document called a after-action report. You guys are familiar with an after-action report? Have you all used these? I'm curious if you all have used after-action reports on your teams, just to, yes? Oh, actually, so maybe like less than a third of us. So great, this is useful. You all have homework. We are in the church of software engineering, so this is one of our commandments here. So the data collection happens at that tactical level. An operation completes, a mission completes. Everybody fills out the after-action reports collected by the team leads. I think you get the idea. That percolates up to the analysts in the military, so that's one level up. Then they compose the recommendations and lessons learned, which are then presented to the strategy stakeholders in the military, generals, colonels, and so on. And they set the doctrine strategy, and then update the training documentations, the training procedures, and so on. And then it's a loop over and over and over again, right? So I think this is actually really useful. Here is an actual after-action report. So this is a simplified one so that we can look at it, but the bones of this is from a real after-action report. What was the objective of the training exercise or the mission or the operation? Who were the participants? I think in our case, that might be useful if we list the tools that we were using. So what was our objective with this new technique and so on? The planning and briefing, so what was the planning with this new feature? How did we set the objectives? The execution of it, how did it go? Were there any challenges or lessons learned? Suppose that we're using a new, let's say an AI-driven SQL generator so that we can just talk in natural language to an AI bot, and it will output SQL statements by referring to our schemas, right? So what were the challenges and lessons learned using that tool? What were some of the hacks? What were some of the quirks? What were some of the things that you learned to get it to perform the way that you wanted it? And what are your recommendations for this tool? And finally, your conclusion. So very simple documents. Again, we do this naturally, I'm sure, but imagine that we did it with intention. I think that was one of the topics that we talked about earlier today. Here's how this applies to us. I think you get the picture here. Here are our team leads. We try a new technique. We fill out our after-action reports. Our directors, our EMs, and so on help us collate, prioritize, sort this, find patterns in it, and then we kind of decide what our strategies and our policies are. This is probably a little bit structured. In practice, I think it's much more democratized than this implies, but you get the picture. And then the important thing is that we do this all over again. We start from the beginning and do the loop. Now, why would we do that? Why would we think about it in this way? Even if we don't implement the after-action reports and reviewing it, why would we want to keep a pulse on this kind of thing and take this kind of input? Well, if we don't do it, then we run the risk of having the trends and whatever vendor out there has the best marketing team dictate some of our technical decisions. I know we all like to think that we're super smart and kind of, maybe, what's the word, contrarian here, but I think marketing teams are also equally sophisticated, and we can get caught up in trends, much like I did with design patterns and microservices and all that other stuff. So the best thing that we can do is build an informed opinion. An informed opinion that we derive directly from things like after-action reports, feedback, innovations, lessons learned, challenges right in the field from our very own teams, from the fingers on the keyboards. And so this is the last little tidbit that I'll leave you with for entering into this new fog of AI. And that is the OODA loop. I'm sure some of you have heard of this. Please raise your hand. Okay, all right. Oh, less than a third again, so I feel like I am breaking new ground here, so sharing some new techniques. So this is actually a concept invented by Colonel John Boyd. He is a famous military strategist. He was in the Air Force. And the idea here is what we want to do when things are uncertain, when we're in that fog of war, is take a step back, breathe, and remember 4 steps. The first, we want to observe. We want to take in the data. In this example, in this talk, that would be our after-action reports, or at least following and checking in on our teams, asking what the challenges were with a new technique or whatever, a database and so on. We're taking in that just raw data. Second is we want to orient ourselves to what we've taken in. So essentially, we want to prioritize it. We want to look for patterns. We want to make, we want to analyze it. So we're taking in this information and making sense of it, orienting ourselves to it. Next, we want to decide. So now that we have the data, now that we've analyzed it, now we see some patterns, how do we decide? What do we decide? What's important? And then finally, we act. And here's the key. When we act, that impacts the environment, that then requires another loop. We're going to observe what the action did, and the loop starts all over again. So rather than try to predict the future about what's going to happen with AI and tech talent, and rather than repeat some of the same, if I may say, like AI bullshit over and over again for blog spam and points, I'm going to leave you all with this philosophy. Take a step back, observe, orient, decide, act, do it over again, taking that feedback from your teams so that we can make decisions. We can allow the work to make the decisions rather than the trends.
Thank you. This was I'm Scott Graves, by the way. This was a brilliant and insightful talk, and I really appreciate how, I might have titled this talk, surviving on an exponential curve, right?
Yes.
And I think that's very practical advice that you've given. And this is really just a personal question for you.
Sure.
Do you feel like that the growth of AI is inside your OODA loop? Because I do. I feel always off balance. And how can you shorten it? Do you just feel like this is total chaos?
I feel completely in the dark, honestly, if I'm just going to be sincere with everybody. Which is why I decided to kind of go back to look at, given that it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the future, I think it's better to look at what's happened in the past and learn from the past, and then grab that framework for how to think about uncertainty now. But I do not feel any more equipped than any of you. I'll make a prediction here. Anytime that we figure out a way to do more things, we do more things. So I wonder if actually we're going to need more software engineers, right? Because of the things that we can do. But I do not feel totally informed at all.
That makes me feel better because
Okay,
I'm
all right.
constantly terrified about
All
this.
right.
I'd kind of like to build on the last question,
Sure.
which I was kind of, that helped me formulate what I was thinking is, when I watch what's happened in Gen AI specifically this year, just the excitement over vaporware, right? Yes, it exists, but everybody was pressured to put it in. Many of you may have had other leaders saying, what are you doing? How are you putting it in? When's it going to be in? And I'm curious if you think about this in terms of the speed at which information shared. We all live on LinkedIn and all of these. And how have you thought about how that might make this one look different than, say, object-oriented or whatever, where news traveled slower? You might not hear about it until many more companies had implemented.
That's a good question. So do we think that now with social media, Twitter, the forms of communication that we have now might impact the way that this is adopted or that the way this rolls out in a way
Yeah.
that didn't happen previously?
Right, it forces you to do the act before
That's
you get to
right.
do the ood.
That's right. I think that's definitely a real risk, especially when, what's curious, how many of you what's different, I think, in this case is how public it is. Because previously, I don't think we had a lot of CEOs. Please, show of hands if your CEO was, we need these design patterns implemented. We need this object-oriented thing implemented, right? No. So I think it's definitely much more pressure. And I think that kind of goes to why, Scott, you're feeling that pressure. I'm feeling overwhelmed and in the dark. In the meantime, we have our CEOs and the executive groups wondering about, like, what are we doing? It's happened to me, right? So my co-founder is asking me, like, Frank, what are we doing with AI? Why don't we have this feature and this feature? And we try to paint the picture that there's a big difference between a product, a feature, a business. Like, they're all very different things, and we're going to waste resources if we don't consider them and invest carefully. I think it's a political problem, a cultural, a communication problem. So I'm glad we have 7 CTOs to help us through those.
I like that you're bringing up the trends, and I feel like the one that was going through like the VC and startup world a few years ago was all about blockchain.
Yes, that's right.
If you don't
That's
have
right.
blockchain, what are you doing?
I should have put it in there.
So I think if you have like a response to like how do you talk to non-technical people about like why or why not we're investing in this, and my second question is how do you make that safe space for your developers to really experiment and learn on things?
So the first question is, can you repeat the first question?
First question is how do you talk to people who are super hyped on an idea that may or may not be relevant?
Yes.
So I do like work through that, and then yeah, the second part is safety and on experimentation for your teams.
Well, that's one of the primary skills that a product manager or you get a new feature request, right? And you don't. I'm just going to spout out some tactics from my experience as a product manager because I think they completely apply. And a good CTO is part product manager anyway. But it's always it's never a no. It's always a okay. But which should I do first? Like, here's the list of the things that we're doing now. Should I stop doing this thing at the top, and should we move it down? So it's always it's tried and true, at least in my experience with my co-founders and my executive team, who asked me to build AI tools for generating resumes and things like that on the platform, which I didn't think was a good idea, but we didn't end up doing it. We walked through it, so that the experience and everything. So the good news is that I think the communication and prioritization patterns and techniques still apply. And then the second question is, how do we make a safe space for the developers to go ahead and experiment and so on? I'll ask you, what kinds of experiments do you have in mind? As in architectural decisions, personal tools? Do you have something in mind there? Yeah. Yeah. So what we do on our team is, actually I just described it, is we all agree to try something out with, we're using ChatGPT now just to kind of test where it's going. And the idea is the experiments. The idea is, okay, we can go ahead and do it. We can go ahead and try it individually. And at the end of the sprint, we're going to fill out these after action reports and actually look through them. So I found it actually super useful because now it's not, it's sanctioned experimentation and iteration and learning rather than like, I'm just going to go sneak this tool in. How many of you had a developer sneak some new package or library thing in that they want to try and it gets past you and you're like, okay, great. Like, now what are the risks here, So maybe that can be a release valve for those early risk takers and bring it into the fold. Mm-hmm.
Hey, Frank. Lou here. Over here.
Yes.
Hey. Yeah, really great talk.
Thank you.
Echo the same things. So I'm thinking we're both around the same age. I can definitely appreciate a lot of the things you just ran through. However, I just wanted to and you kind of allude to this, I think you probably would agree, there are shades of gray, right? Like there's like, I wouldn't necessarily throw out the baby with the bathwater
Yes, yes.
on all things here. Like I kind of hearken back to the comments you made about Hibernate and all the
Yeah, yeah.
crazy like code generation XML. I went through that myself. But at the same time, like I think back to like the Spring framework, which brought in dependency injection, and I'm still using
Yeah.
injection today in different languages. I'm just I want to touch on microservices a little
Yes,
bit.
yes, please.
Am I doing something wrong if I feel like I'm using them right, like we're using them effectively? I feel like our web application is somewhat of a monolith. I mean, it does have a services backend, but we are doing still some, I mean, I grew up in the SOA era and
Yes,
morphed into microservices. I'm just curious if you're like, is it black and white to you, or do you see like, is there still capabilities that you would still build with microservices?
No, it's definitely not black and white. But to illustrate points, it's much easier to just say, this is black and this is white, good, bad. But in practice, it's a theoretical way to think about it. In practice, it's, even in some of the stories that I described, even when they reverted, they didn't revert completely back. They figured out where to apply a microservice, where to apply a monolith. I think the broader point is that it's hard to tell ahead of time. And the idea being that if we can keep our finger on that pulse of innovation, feedback, challenges, lessons learned, maybe we can, and we keep things in mind like the sunk cost fallacy and so on, maybe we can react faster. Maybe we won't be pushed one way or the other by the winds of trendy technology or what other people might be using. So I think it serves, when it's black and white, it serves as a parable, a reminder, but it is never, in practice, I don't know any company that looks at the agile, thinks they're doing agile perfectly and retros perfectly and so on. Yeah.
I think, again, great talk, and I like the way you presented everything. I like the framework, but I'm a little confused about the granularity of it, because, I mean, clearly, if somebody wants to put a new validation library on the front end or back end, maybe you wouldn't want to have process around that. Maybe you would. I don't know where you're drawing the lines on that stuff. And then another thing that kind of jumped out to me was I feel like for all these different types of bad choices or trends, there were folks who were naive about it and then folks who were effective with it. So in OOD, for example, I know a lot of people who did good stuff with that because it was kind of the tooling of the time, right?
Yeah.
We've moved away from OOD. We don't use it anymore. But it's not what I would pick today. But at that time when C# was hot and Java, it'd be kind of hard not to use it, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
I guess for me, some of the examples, it felt like maybe it was the naive choices, like switching your database completely from relational to NoSQL.
For sure.
I don't think they probably did. I was at Dell. I don't think you could have done that at Dell. They would have been like, what are you, crazy?
Yeah, yeah,
Because there
yeah.
was enough smart people in the building that somebody would have said, no, that's not going to work. We need transactional as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Definitely, I don't think the heavyweight process for something like this, I'm sorry, if all a dev wants to do is try out a new validation library or something like that, then I wouldn't recommend thinking about it this way. I think what worries me, I guess, and what I'm trying to keep my finger on the pulse of are the personal code generating tools that developers are using. I'm curious, have any of you all written code yet with ChatGPT, and pushed it into production and everything? No, so I got a lot of no, okay. You did push it in production? It was just fine, right? It's not a big deal? Yeah. Yeah. That's right. So what I'm more concerned about is as those tools get more sophisticated, as they can do more and more and more, what are the risks in terms of, what are the unforeseen risks? I can't say, are they legal? Are they, I don't know. Is there a hidden N+1 ORM problem in there with the way that things get generated? So I want to be able to just capture those so that I have an informed opinion later on. but I'm not trying, it's not a process that I think we would apply for something like a data validation library or anything like that. It's more of a, how do I put it, of a structure to take in feedback from teams generally about the technologies and the work that they're doing, so that we have an intentional, informed opinion about some of the trends. And I know maybe some of you aren't naive enough to just like switch to NoSQL, but some pretty smart people, were really bullish on it, right? Some world-class teams were bullish on it, and if they're convinced, then I don't have a chance, right? So I'm gonna get myself informed as well as I can. And what was the second part of the question, Ryan?
I was just wondering more about where that line was.
Yeah.
But even like N+1, for example,
Yeah.
that was a developer problem, right?
Yep.
It's just like garbage collection in C#
Yeah.
and event subscriptions. Like people started thinking about memory management, but again, it was still kind of I feel like a lot of the problems are not really the tools, but that the devs aren't using them right.
That's right. And that in itself is also a risk, right? So what if we go into this thinking the tools are the problem, and then what we realize when we're paying attention, when we're using these loops, actually it's the developers that need the training.
Yeah.
And the policy for our as CTOs is, okay, if we're going to use these tools, then we're going to have to institute some sort of training and so on. I'm trying to make it so that we're a little bit more, proactive about the potential risks,
Yeah.
rather than watching them happen and after the fact and
Yeah,
reacting.
yeah. You
after
have
the
to go
fact.
before or after, right?
That's right. Yes,
Incident
that's right.
response or.
That's right, yeah.
Hi.
Yes.
Hey, so from a risk perspective, obviously your company's an intellectual property getting sent to a third party, it being ChatGPT. Do you see a trend in, do you see a trend in organizations implementing towards a third party API like that, or bringing the competency internal to the organization and having an AI team with your own trained models? What are your thoughts on the future there?
I don't know so much about that, but I have been thinking a little bit about how we will recruit developers that will use these kinds of tools. And something that occurred to me and I kind of read about is the idea that these generative AI models are trained on, let's say everything written on the internet since whatever, plus all the open source code and all those things out there. And if you want to be able to use it effectively, it really, really helps to think clearly, to write a clear prompt, to provide examples, to actually have a vocabulary about concepts in humanities, right? Literature, architecture, mathematics, and so on. And so I'm thinking about it, and I'm wondering, I wonder if, one of the, when I heard the term prompt engineer, I thought, oh, that sounds like BS. Like, is that really a thing? But if you're going to draw from the corpus of human knowledge, then you better have a broad vocabulary for the concepts that we've created in humanities, essentially. And I'm wondering if the engineer of the future is a software engineer, but also a humanities expert or a product manager, and it's weighted more, those skills are weighted more than the way that we do a Google interview now. So.
ChatGPT and Copilot, they don't use.
They don't, yeah.
They don't use your code to train the model.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
unless your code is public, it won't get affected.
Okay, good.
All right.
All right.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you all.